Picture a closed-door House Ethics Committee session on November 3, 2025, where the first thing you hear isn't a speech about policy or a lecture about decorum, but a number that lands like a cinder block: $4.2 million. In this telling, Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino doesn't raise his voice or pound the table. He just drops the figure and lets the air change in the room. He frames it like a routine money question, the way cops do when they already know what the paperwork says, and they're watching to see what you do with it. He says Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her partner, Riley Roberts, bought a mansion in Wesley Heights on June 15, 2025, and he claims the purchase was all cash, no mortgage. Then he sets the hook with the kind of arithmetic you can't filibuster. A $174,000 congressional salary doesn't naturally grow into a $4.2 million check. Silence, silence in this story, is the loudest character in the room. AOC is at the witness table, flanked by 3 lawyers whose suits look like they cost more than a Bronx studio's annual rent. She wears a burgundy blazer and the familiar gold hoops, the polished, "I belong on camera" look that made her brand feel both rebellious and curated at the same time. But the vibe is different, because the session is described as sealed from the press while still being recorded for the official record, which is Washington's favorite way of saying private for now. And when Bongino asks where the missing millions came from, the pause stretches just long enough for everyone to start doing their own mental math. The script leans into the irony without needing to shout it. A self-styled democratic socialist, famous for dunking on wealthy elites, now allegedly sitting across from a guy presented as a money trail specialist with binders full of receipts. AOC's fingers grip the edge of the table, and her eyes flick to her counsel like she's waiting for the right line to appear on a teleprompter that isn't there. If you've watched enough hearings, you know that look. The moment someone realizes this isn't about optics anymore. It's about documents. In this narrative, AOC initially treats it like another partisan fishing expedition. She expects it's about the tax the rich dress from the Met Gala, because that's the old argument everyone's already fought on social media. She expects to tweet through it, fundraise through it, and walk out with her base more energized than before. That's the modern playbook. Turn any attack into proof you're effective, and your followers do the rest. But the twist here is that the attack is framed not as a shouting match, but as an allegedly 14-month financial review with subpoenas, bank records, and timelines. The story introduces a second character who matters more than most people realize: a financial crimes agent. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez, in the script, sits near Bongino with a laptop open, like she's ready to pull up a transaction the way other people pull up a meme. She's described as a career investigator who's followed insider trading, white-collar fraud, and political corruption long enough to know that the loudest scandals aren't always the biggest ones. Her job, in this telling, isn't to deliver zingers. It's to connect dots in a way that survives a courtroom. And the entire vibe of the room becomes, if they're bringing this kind of personnel, someone thinks they have something. Bongino, in the imagined scene, makes a point of sounding almost bored. He says the question is simple, and he repeats it like a prosecutor who wants the record clean. Where did the additional money come from? He uses the salary figure, the years in office, and the hypothetical maximum savings as if he's building a chalkboard proof. He doesn't call her names, he doesn't lean into ideology, he just keeps returning to the math. That's what makes it feel dangerous, because math doesn't care how many followers you have. AOC, in the script, tries to pivot to privacy. She calls it harassment, framed as targeting a woman of color who challenges the establishment, which is an argument that has worked for her before in public debates. But Bongino, still in this fictionalized telling, responds with the cold version of public service. When you're a public official, your finances aren't just your business. He frames it as public interest, the phrase that can either protect democracy or justify voyeurism depending on who's saying it. Then he slides papers across the table like he's feeding a printer, not a narrative. Here's where the story gets careful, because this is the moment that can easily become a defamation trap if you tell it like a documentary. So this version treats the documents as purported and the trail as alleged, and it keeps asking questions instead of delivering verdicts. Bongino points to 3 wire transfers, all within a week of the claimed home purchase, and he says they add up to the exact purchase price. He names the senders as Delaware LLCs with patriotic-sounding titles that could either be legitimate advocacy vehicles or shells, depending on what the underlying records show. And he asks the committee, and the audience by extension, to consider why a newly active LLC would receive identical amounts timed so perfectly to a closing date. The script loves Delaware because Delaware is the classic setting for suspicious corporate theater. It describes Delaware as a place where you can form entities with minimal public disclosure, which is true enough to feel plausible without needing to cite a statute. The fictional flow is money moves into opaque vehicles, then out again, and suddenly what looks like support becomes personal benefit. Bongino points to the memo lines, grant disbursement, political support, movement building, and asks what those words mean when the money allegedly ends up in a home purchase. That question is the kind that doesn't accuse directly, but still feels like a spotlight. At this point, the story introduces a character type Washington hates, the skeptical colleague. A Republican member asks who's behind the LLCs, not because Republicans are immune to dark money, but because hearings are theater, and everyone plays their part. Bongino answers by pointing higher on the chart, to a network described as a donor coordination hub for progressive billionaires. He names George Soros, Open Society Foundations, and Democracy Alliance, because those names are gasoline in American politics even when the details are complicated. But instead of shouting Soros like a cartoon villain reveal, he treats it as a question about origin, routing, and documentation. The story walks the audience through a flow chart like it's explaining a subway map. At the top are donor entities and advocacy networks, then intermediary groups, then LLCs, then what's described as AOC's personal LLC. The numbers are presented as if they are exact, which is why a responsible narrator keeps calling them claimed within the scenario. Because the tension isn't, is she good or bad? It's, if this paperwork exists as described, how does anyone explain it cleanly? And in Washington, cleanly is the whole game. The committee room, in this telling, shifts from partisan mood music to something closer to professional dread. Even the Democrats are described as less performative than usual, because money scandals don't respect party branding the way policy fights do. A sympathetic member asks whether the implication is really that AOC received millions linked to Soros networks. Bongino, as scripted, answers with the kind of phrase that's technically careful but emotionally explosive. Approximately, documented so far. Additional amounts possible. It's not a conviction, it's a suggestion that the iceberg might be bigger than the visible part. Then the story pivots to the boyfriend angle, because that's the kind of detail that makes viewers lean in. Riley Roberts, in this script, runs a company called Digital Outreach Strategies, which is the kind of name that sounds like it could be a real consulting outfit or a mailbox with ambition. The narrative says the company received $1.6 million from PACs and groups aligned with AOC over several years. It frames the money as consulting fees, and then it plants the question every viewer is already thinking, what work exactly justified those invoices? And it's careful to present that as an investigative question, not a settled conclusion. Special Agent Martinez, in the story, reads deposition-style quotes where past officials give vague answers. They say strategy, insights, informal consultation, the kind of language that can either describe real work or describe, "We can't explain this because there's nothing to show." The script emphasizes the absence of obvious deliverables. No attributed websites, no identifiable campaign products, no documentation that looks like $1.6 million worth of labor. But it never says no work happened. It says the work product couldn't be clearly identified, which is the difference between a question and an accusation. That's important, because questions create suspense, while accusations create lawsuits. The narrative builds the insinuation without landing the punch. It calls the arrangement the kind of scheme investigators look for, where money can't be paid directly to an official, so it's routed through family or partner businesses. It describes high profit margins and low expenses as suspicious indicators, which they can be, but they can also be normal for certain consulting setups. The point isn't to prove guilt. The point is to force the viewer to confront how easily ethical lines can blur when politics becomes a lifestyle industry. And that's not about AOC alone. It's about the incentives of the whole machine. Now the story returns to the Met Gala, because that's the symbol the audience already recognizes. AOC's Tax the Rich dress is iconic, and that makes it narratively convenient. A ready-made contrast between message and perceived luxury. Bongino, in this fictional hearing, describes ticket prices, custom dress valuations, hair and makeup costs, and then frames it as a question of gift rules and reporting thresholds. The committee's reaction is described as uneasy because no one wants to defend rule violations on the record. But the script avoids saying she broke the law, and instead asks whether the event was truly official duties or a celebrity scene dressed up as politics. This is where the satire sneaks in, because American politics is basically a comedy that forgot it's also a tragedy. The narrator in this style can't resist a line like, "If the Met Gala is official congressional work, then half of Hollywood should be filing committee reports." It's light enough to keep the audience breathing, but sharp enough to keep the knife in. The script frames loaned clothing as a loophole people talk about, then asks whether a loan is meaningfully different from a gift when the benefit is access and image. Again, it's skepticism, not prosecution. Then it expands the pattern. Multiple events, multiple designer outfits, a running total that sounds outrageous. The story says investigators documented around $150,000 in high-end clothing over 3 years, presented as unreported gifts. A cautious narrator would keep this phrased as alleged estimates, because valuation in fashion is a swamp of branding, comps, and marketing. But the point isn't the precise number. The point is the narrative collision between working-class champion and red carpet regular. That collision is the tension that holds the whole piece together. Next comes the tax return segment, because nothing terrifies politicians like spreadsheets. The story lays out reported income climbing over time, salary plus book advances, royalties, speaking fees, maybe other legitimate streams. It then compares that to the lifestyle implied by the mansion, luxury travel, and high-end appearances. The narrator frames it like a late-night question asked over an open laptop. If the reported numbers are accurate, where does the rest come from? It's not "she evaded taxes," it's "the picture doesn't seem to match," which is enough to keep the suspicion alive without declaring a crime. The script adds another rhetorical move, the "only two explanations" line. That's a classic investigator's trick, because it funnels the audience toward guilt even while pretending to be neutral. A safer version would phrase it as a few possibilities, including benign ones like family money, prior savings, legitimate loans, or asset appreciation. So this rewrite includes those possibilities, then says, the hearing's drama comes from the claim that none of those explanations appear in the purported records. The suspense is created by what's missing, not by what's declared. The most viral part of the story is the split-screen hypocrisy reel. On one side, AOC's real public statements about billionaires and dark money. On the other side, the documents the investigators claim tell a different story. That technique is powerful because it doesn't require you to shout. It lets the viewer supply the outrage. The rewrite keeps it as presented in the hearing rather than true, because the audience should understand this is a dramatized scenario, not a news report. But the emotional engine is clear. People hate feeling sold a brand that doesn't match the backstage receipts. At the climax, the script turns to the Fifth Amendment moment. In real life, invoking the Fifth is a constitutional right and not proof of guilt. But in politics, it can look like a confession, because optics are cruel. In the story, AOC's lawyer, Mark Elias, warns that questions could implicate her rights against self-incrimination. The committee reacts because everyone knows the headline writes itself when someone declines to answer. And the narrator leans into the tension without saying the quiet part out loud. Bongino, in this narrative, asks a string of yes or no questions, like a metronome. Did you receive the money? Did you use it this way? Did your partner get paid? Did you report gifts? Did you disclose clothing? Did you do this? Did you do that? Elias responds with a consistent line. On advice of counsel, she declines to answer. The room becomes a pressure cooker, because each refusal sounds like another door closing. But the rewrite keeps reminding the viewer that rights exist for a reason, and refusing to answer is not the same as being guilty. The script then shows the political argument collapsing into the financial argument. AOC tries to frame it as a targeted smear, and a Republican member replies with the dull brutality of arithmetic. We're here because the numbers don't track. That exchange is the heart of the piece, because it pits identity-based political messaging against the cold documentation of money flows. The narrator doesn't need to mock anyone's identity. The drama is about how every side uses narratives as armor. And money, when traceable, can pierce that armor. From there, the story accelerates into consequences, referrals to DOJ, IRS, FEC, suspension from committees, potential expulsion. Every line is designed to feel like the machine finally turning on one of its stars. It describes leaks happening within hours, because Washington treats secrecy like a decorative suggestion. The photos of the alleged mansion are juxtaposed with the Met Gala image, because modern scandal is always an image war. And the rewrite keeps these as what the story claims happened, not what happened, to avoid presenting fiction as reporting. Then comes the grand jury and indictment arc, which is the part that must be handled with the most caution. The original text states charges and outcomes as if they're historical fact, which would be a serious claim about real people. This version reframes it as an imagined projection. In the script, prosecutors move quickly. In this scenario, an indictment follows. In the dramatization, a trial begins. That keeps it in the realm of political thriller rather than defamatory assertion. The tension remains because audiences understand the language of what if without needing you to pretend it's a press release. The courtroom segment is written like classic American scandal fiction. A federal judge is described as fair, unsentimental, unimpressed by slogans, focused on conduct and documentation. Defense arguments are summarized as plausible responses. Donations versus personal benefit, consulting versus deliverables, loans versus gifts, misunderstanding versus intent. Prosecution arguments are framed as what they would say if the evidence were as presented: timing, routing, patterns, inconsistencies. The rewrite never says she committed crimes. It says the jury in the story finds, which keeps it clearly in narrative territory. Sentencing in this dramatization is treated as the moral thunderclap. The judge's speech is written as a condemnation of betrayal of trust, because that's the classic American civic wound, the feeling of being played. The story emphasizes the contrast between public persona and private enrichment, because that's what makes scandal universal. It also adds a subtle note: people can advocate for higher taxes and still live well. The issue is whether the enrichment came from improper roots. That line matters because it keeps the focus on ethics and transparency, not ideology. The political fallout section is where the narrator can widen the lens. Other progressive figures are described as issuing carefully worded statements, because politics is the art of distancing without detonating your own coalition. The donor networks are shown scrambling to deny knowledge, dissolve entities, and move on, because institutions prioritize survival over confession. Media outlets are described as struggling with their own role, not because the narrator is whining about the press, but because modern fame is a co-production. And the audience is left with the core question: how many authentic brands are just products waiting for an audit? This rewrite also sprinkles in small, plausible fictional flourishes to deepen the scene without pretending they're verifiable. A staffer's phone buzzing non-stop, a stenographer pausing to look up, the weird hush when even partisan warriors stop smiling, a committee member staring at the flowchart like it's a maze designed by someone who hates sunlight, a lawyer whispering too quickly, too close, the way people do when they're trying to outrun the record. These details don't claim truth. They create atmosphere, and atmosphere is what makes a long voiceover watchable. To keep the tone American, it uses the rhythm of talk radio skepticism without the cheap nastiness. It pokes at Washington's hypocrisy as a system rather than attacking protected groups or making personal slurs. It uses irony, not hatred, and it uses questions like pressure points rather than conclusions like verdicts. The narrator can say, "Maybe there's an innocent explanation," and then immediately ask why that explanation didn't show up in the alleged paper trail. That's how you keep suspense alive while staying on the right side of responsible storytelling. And the ending doesn't demand that the audience do anything, because calls to action are the quickest way to turn commentary into a mob scene. Instead, it lands on a colder takeaway. Politics is a business now, and brands are fragile when money moves in ways that can't be easily explained. If you build your identity around fighting elites, you will be judged more harshly for any whiff of elite comfort, fair or unfair, true or not. And if an investigator ever walks into a room with two thick binders and a calm voice, the only thing that matters is what the pages can actually prove. Because in America, slogans can win elections, but receipts, real receipts, are what decide whether the story survives. The next phase of the story isn't the part with the flashy screenshots or the dramatic gasps. It's the part where everyone in the room suddenly remembers that Washington runs on paper and procedure. In this imagined sequence, the committee doesn't argue about ideology first, it argues about jurisdiction, because that's how adults in suits avoid saying what they're thinking. Who has the authority to demand what? What gets referred where? What becomes part of a record? What stays sealed? What leaks anyway? And who can plausibly pretend they didn't leak it? And sitting there, at the center of it, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez isn't dealing with a hostile cable segment anymore. She's dealing with the slow, grinding machinery that doesn't care how good your clapbacks are. The whole thing, in this telling, turns into one big question with 1,000 smaller questions hiding inside it. If the narrative is, "This is political," why does it look so administrative? One member wants to pause, another wants to adjourn, a third wants to review the documents privately, which is Washington speak for, "I need to call my staff and figure out what the heck I'm looking at." Bongino, as portrayed, doesn't celebrate, because a professional investigator doesn't spike the football in front of the referee. He just keeps narrowing the frame and tightening the screws the way an interviewer does when they're trying to separate what someone wants to be true from what they're willing to say under oath. He restates the basic sequence again, slower, like he's giving the court reporter a clean transcript. Entity formed, transfers received, property purchased, all within a tight window. And then he asks the question nobody wants to answer out loud because it sounds too cynical even for Capitol Hill. Why would a movement-building transfer be structured like a home closing? AOC's counsel, in this version, tries to carve out safe territory by leaning on language like advocacy, public engagement, political education, the kind of terms that can be broad enough to cover almost anything. The committee members let them talk for a minute, because sometimes letting a lawyer talk is the quickest way to see what they won't talk about. The narrator points out how carefully the words are selected, like they're trying to step across a minefield without making any promises that could later be challenged by a spreadsheet. And AOC herself, when she speaks, leans into the familiar theme of being targeted, an argument that can be heartfelt and also strategically useful at the same time. But the story keeps circling back to the same uncomfortable point. Even a sincere political argument doesn't automatically answer a financial one. Now the script widens the lens to the people who aren't in that room but are still part of the drama. Staff, donors, allies, rivals, and the silent class of consultants who live off everyone else's reputation. Outside the hearing, in this imagined world, text messages start flying the minute the gavel drops. Because Washington is basically a group chat with marble columns. One side is asking, "Is this real?" The other side is asking, "How bad is it?" And the third side, the side nobody admits exists, is asking, "How do we position ourselves if it is?" There's a difference between loyalty and survival, and the story plays in that gray space the way political thrillers always do, because the audience instinctively understands that the moment a scandal becomes plausible, people begin drafting their exit lines. In the continuation, the narrative doesn't need to claim anyone did anything criminal to keep the heat on. All it needs is the idea that certain patterns, if they exist, raise obvious questions that any reasonable person would ask. Why the Delaware structure? Why the timing? Why the matching total? Why the memo lines that sound like activism but behave like accounting? Why would an entity described as a progressive education vehicle have only one obvious function: holding a residential property? And if there's a perfectly benign explanation, why does it feel like everyone is straining to find it after the fact, instead of having it ready on day one? The story then introduces the thing that turns a scandal from a headline into a long-term problem: second-order questions. It's not just where did the money come from, it's who knew what, when, and who signed what, and what was disclosed, and what wasn't, and why. A committee member asks about financial disclosures because that's where reputations go to die. Those forms are boring until they're not. Another asks about valuation and reporting standards because in the real world people fight about what counts as a gift, what counts as a loan, and what counts as something you're just borrowing for the night. And the narrator leans into the American suspicion that the rules always look strict on paper and flexible in practice, especially for people with the right connections. At this point, the story's satire turns toward the culture that made this kind of plot believable in the first place. Politics used to be about committees, caucuses, and local party machines. Now it's about personal brands, and brands get monetized. If you're famous enough, you don't just raise money, you generate attention. And attention gets converted into deals, invitations, speaking opportunities, and a whole ecosystem of people who want to attach themselves to your name. So the narrator asks, not as an accusation, but as a cultural diagnosis, at what point does movement become market? And if you're a politician who built your legend on being anti-elite, how do you live in the influencer economy without getting stained by it? This is where the continuation gets more intense, because it hints at how quickly the story would mutate once it left the room. Even if the hearing was supposed to be closed, the idea of it leaking is enough to set off the usual chain reaction. Opponents don't need the whole file. They need a few memorable details and a narrative frame that fits on a phone screen. Supporters don't need rebuttal briefs. They need a reason to believe the whole thing is a setup, because belief is faster than verification. And somewhere in the middle are ordinary voters who aren't obsessed with either side, but who can smell inconsistency the way people smell smoke. In the dramatized aftermath, AOC's team goes into crisis mode, because that's what teams do. They workshop language that threads a needle, deny wrongdoing without making specific factual claims that could later be compared to documents. They emphasize that political giving networks are complex, that nonprofits and advocacy groups often share donors, that lawful support can come through multiple channels. They stress that public figures are routinely targeted with insinuations, especially women who challenge power, which can be true and still not resolve a balance sheet. And the narrator notes, with a little bite, that in Washington, the safest sentence is usually one that sounds passionate while saying almost nothing testable. Meanwhile, in this story, Bongino and Martinez aren't chasing vibes. They're chasing corroboration. If the binders exist, they're not built out of tweets. They're built out of records, subpoenas, and chain of custody discipline. The narrative talks about bank confirmations, beneficial ownership, signature authority, account opening packets, the dull stuff that makes dramatic claims either stand or collapse. And because the story is careful, it keeps those as what investigators would look for, not what they definitely found. The suspense comes from the sense that the next leak won't be a quote. It'll be a form with a signature line. The continuation also introduces a quieter character, the uneasy ally. A Democrat on the committee who's been generally sympathetic to AOC in public starts asking procedural questions that sound neutral but carry a sharp edge. Were these transfers disclosed anywhere? Were they treated as income? Were they listed as loans? Was there documentation of repayment terms? Were there restrictions on use? It's not a gotcha. It's the kind of inquiry that signals a political friend trying to locate the nearest lifeboat without admitting they're looking. And that's the most chilling moment in any political story. When the friendly faces stop smiling and start auditing. The script builds a new layer of tension around Riley Roberts because scandals love a second protagonist. AOC's counsel says she isn't responsible for the details of her partner's business, which is a reasonable sentence in normal life. But the narrator points out that politics isn't normal life because proximity itself becomes the issue. If PACs aligned with her, Orbit paid a partner's company substantial sums, voters are going to ask if that looks like influence, even if it's legal, and even if the work was real. And if the work was real, the story asks, why is it so hard, within the dramatization, to point to anything concrete that looks like $1.6 million worth of output? The humor here is subtle, the way American political humor usually is when it's trying not to sound mean. The narrator jokes that a digital outreach company without a visible footprint is like a steakhouse with no grill, which might be unfair, but it lands because it captures the intuitive skepticism, and then it pulls back and adds the responsible qualifier. Some consulting is genuinely behind the scenes, some work is proprietary, some deliverables are private. Fine. So the question becomes, if confidentiality explains the lack of public artifacts, what explains the lack of internal artifacts described in the hearing? Now, the story's escalation comes from a strategic choice. The anchor evidence stays the mansion. The house, the neighborhood, the price, the timing, those are concrete enough to feel real even inside a dramatized scenario. The narrator describes Wesley Heights the way DC insiders do. Quiet money, diplomatic neighbors, and the kind of privacy that's expensive by definition. It contrasts that with AOC's public persona as a tribune of working-class struggle, without mocking her background or identity. Because the point isn't that successful people can't live well. It's that political brands built on anti-elite messaging get judged by anti-elite standards. In the continuation, the narrator adds plausible alternative explanations, not to let anyone off the hook, but to keep the story honest and sharper. Maybe there was family wealth. Maybe there were investments. Maybe there were legitimate loans. Maybe there was a property sale. Maybe the cash purchase was mischaracterized. Maybe the amount was wrong. Those aren't excuses. They're the basic range of possibilities any fair-minded person would consider before turning suspicion into certainty. But the tension comes from the claim that the hearing's presentation left those explanations dangling without supporting paperwork. And if that's true in the story, you can feel why the room would tighten. Uncertainty is scary when it's surrounded by documents. The imagined leak cycle gets nastier, because that's what happens when people smell blood in a political media ecosystem. Pundits start speaking in absolutes even when they don't have the file, because outrage sells better than caution. Others start calling it a witch hunt without reading a single page, because tribal defense is quicker than due diligence. The narrator makes a point of how little patience America has for wait and see when a scandal offers immediate dopamine. And then it asks the viewer a loaded question. Who benefits most from you picking a side before you know the facts? There's a second crescendo built around the donor network flowchart, because that's the kind of visual that persuades emotionally even when the underlying complexity is enormous. Democracy Alliance, Open Society Foundations, allied nonprofits, PACs, LLCs, the web is easy to draw and hard to fully interpret. The story asks whether coordination is proof of corruption or just how modern politics works on both sides of the aisle. If billionaires coordinate progressive giving, do you think conservative billionaires don't coordinate theirs? And if coordination is normal, why does routing money into a personal LLC still feel like a different category, at least in this dramatized scenario? From there, the story tightens again into the hearing room, because that's where power shifts happen. Chairman Michael Guest, in this narrative, isn't interested in philosophy. He wants answers that can be written into a referral memo. He gives AOC an opening to clarify, to provide context, to offer documentation, to say anything that would make the sequence look less like a pipeline and more like a misunderstanding. But the dramatization leans into the image of a politician discovering that moral language doesn't automatically override procedural scrutiny. And the narrator adds a line that feels very American. Your values don't get audited. Your wiring instructions do. The continuation ends this section by setting up the next chapter without pretending it's history. If the scenario continues, The fight wouldn't be a shouting match. It would be a contest over records, definitions, intent, and disclosure. The most dangerous thing for any public figure wouldn't be a viral clip. It would be a document that contradicts the public story in a way the public can understand in 5 seconds. And in this dramatized world, everybody feels that approaching. Allies, enemies, journalists, donors, staff, and the voters who don't know the rules but know when something smells off. Because the real cliffhanger isn't who's right, it's what does the next piece of paper show?